There are discoveries that answer a question, and then there are discoveries that make the question larger. In the spring of 1900, off the small island of Antikythera between Crete and mainland Greece, a group of sponge divers descended into deep, cold water wearing heavy canvas suits and copper helmets, expecting to find little more than the seabed. What they encountered instead was a field of shapes that did not belong there. Bronze limbs, marble torsos, fragments of human forms scattered across the floor of a shipwreck that had not seen light for nearly 2,000 years. The ship they had found was not ordinary cargo. It carried wealth in a form meant to be seen. Statues, glassware, finely crafted objects likely being transported toward Roman markets where Greek art was highly valued. This was a moving collection, a shipment that reflected both cultural admiration and economic demand, suggesting a world where objects did not remain fixed but traveled across distances shaped by trade and power. Among these objects, something far less recognizable was recovered in 1901. It did not resemble art or wealth. It appeared as a corroded mass, bronze fused with mineral deposits, broken into fragments that did not immediately suggest purpose. It was set aside, overshadowed by the more obvious significance of statues and sculpture, its meaning delayed not by absence of evidence but by the way it presented itself. In 1902, Greek archaeologist Valerios Stais noticed something inside one of the fragments that changed the trajectory of the object entirely. Embedded within the corrosion was a gear, precisely cut, structured, intentional. This was not decorative detail, it was mechanical. And once one gear was recognized, others followed, revealing that what had been assumed to be debris was in fact the remains of a device built to move, to calculate, and to represent something far more complex than initially imagined. The presence of gears immediately introduced a different category of object. Gears imply relationships, one movement linked to another, motion translated through structure. This was not a static artifact. It had once been a functioning system. And systems of this kind do not exist without purpose. They are designed to produce outcomes, to translate input into predictable results. As more fragments were examined, it became clear that this device had once been enclosed in a wooden case, with dials on its surfaces and inscriptions carved into its plates. It was not large. It could be held, opened, and operated by hand. A user could turn a handle, and the internal gears would engage, setting the entire system into motion. What those movements represented would take decades to understand. At first, the device resisted classification. It did not align with known tools of the period. It appeared too complex for its assumed origin, too deliberate to be accidental, and too structured to be dismissed. The difficulty was not in seeing its parts, but in accepting what those parts suggested. Eventually, the pattern began to emerge. The machine was modeling the sky, not symbolically but mechanically. It could track the movement of the sun and moon, align lunar and solar cycles, and predict eclipses using known astronomical patterns. This was not observational record. It was calculation embodied in motion. The implications of that function extended beyond the object itself. To build such a device required not only knowledge of astronomy, but the ability to translate that knowledge into ratios that could be physically encoded. Each gear tooth represented a relationship, each rotation a calculation. This was applied understanding, not abstract theory alone. This kind of translation does not happen without context. The Hellenistic world was a place where disciplines intersected. Mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and philosophy interacting in ways that allowed knowledge to move between forms. The mechanism reflects that environment, where ideas could be tested not only in writing, but in material construction. If the Antikythera mechanism is approached only as an isolated object, it can be contained. It can be described, reconstructed in partial form, placed behind glass, and explained as an early example of complex engineering. But the moment it is understood as evidence of capability rather than exception, the frame expands and the object begins to exert pressure on everything around it. Because a machine like this does not exist without a surrounding structure that allows it to be conceived, designed, and built, it requires not only knowledge of astronomical cycles, but agreement on those cycles, shared understanding precise enough that it can be translated into fixed mechanical relationships. It requires tools capable of cutting gear teeth with consistency, materials that can hold those shapes under repeated motion, and a level of craftsmanship that can align multiple interacting parts without causing failure. It also requires a reason, not a vague curiosity about the sky, but a defined purpose, whether educational, demonstrative, predictive, or symbolic. The mechanism encodes cycles that matter within the structure of Hellenistic timekeeping. Lunar months, solar years, eclipse patterns, calendrical alignment. and references to events such as athletic games that followed regulated cycles. This is not abstract cosmology detached from lived experience. It is a system that connects celestial movement to human scheduling, ritual, and organization. That connection places the mechanism within a broader framework of how time was understood and used. Calendars governed agriculture, religious observances, civic obligations, and seasonal cycles. A device capable of modeling and predicting those cycles would not only reflect knowledge, it would organize it, and organization introduces another layer: control. Not control in the modern sense, but the ability to anticipate and align human activity with predictable natural patterns. Eclipses, for example, are dramatic phenomena. They interrupt the expected pattern of light. To predict them is to transform them from surprise into sequence. The mechanism reframes them as part of a known system. The mechanism does not eliminate the event, but it changes how it is understood. It reflects a worldview in which patterns can be identified, measured, and relied upon. A worldview where celestial movement is not only observed but expressed through consistent relationships. The Antikythera Mechanism embodies that worldview in a way that is difficult to dismiss. It does not argue for it. It demonstrates it. Yet even within that demonstration, there are limits. The machine does not capture everything, and parts of its design remain uncertain due to missing components. Some reconstructions suggest planetary motion may have been included, but the evidence is incomplete, leaving room for interpretation. This uncertainty is not weakness. It is the boundary of the artifact, the edge where evidence ends and reasoning begins. The mechanism operates at the intersection of multiple forms of knowledge: mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and language. Each layer supports the others, forming a system that is coherent but not fully recoverable. What survives can be measured and mapped. Gear ratios can be tested. Inscriptions can be translated. But missing components leave space between certainty and interpretation. Different models attempt to fill that space, each aligning with certain evidence while leaving other questions unresolved. This reflects the nature of the knowledge it encodes. Astronomy was not a single unified system, but a field of competing models and evolving ideas. The mechanism may represent one such synthesis, capturing a specific approach to understanding celestial motion. If that is the case, then it is not just a machine. It is a record of intellectual choice. It reflects what was considered important to measure, what cycles were prioritized, and how knowledge was shaped into usable form. Understanding the mechanism is not only about what it includes, but what it leaves out. Because every model is selective, it highlights certain relationships while excluding others, revealing as much about human intention as it does about the natural world. That raises a further question. If this machine represents one version of astronomical understanding, what other versions existed that were never mechanized, or were mechanized but did not survive? The absence of comparable surviving devices does not eliminate those possibilities. It simply limits what can be confirmed. This is where the Antikythera mechanism becomes less a singular object and more a point of entry into a broader uncertainty. It demonstrates that the ancient world possessed the capacity to produce complex, integrated mechanical representations of knowledge. It does not demonstrate how widespread that capacity was, how frequently it was exercised, or how it was transmitted across generations. Transmission is the critical factor. Knowledge, even when highly developed, does not persist automatically. It depends on continuity, on teaching, on replication, on the existence of structures that support its use. When those structures weaken or change, knowledge can fragment. Fragmentation does not necessarily mean immediate loss. It can exist in partial forms, preserved in texts, in isolated practices, in memories that are not fully integrated into a functioning system. Over time, however, without reinforcement, even fragments can become disconnected from their original context. The mechanism may be one of the few surviving points where multiple fragments remained connected long enough to be recognized as a system. That recognition required more than the survival of the object itself. It required a modern framework capable of interpreting it. Without the development of mechanical engineering as a discipline, without an understanding of gear systems, without the ability to model ratios and cycles, the mechanism might still appear as an unusual collection of shapes rather than a coherent device. In this sense, the Antikythera mechanism is not only dependent on its ancient creators, it is dependent on modern interpreters. This dual dependence complicates the idea of discovery. The object was physically recovered in the early 20th century, but its function was not immediately understood. That understanding developed over decades, shaped by advances in both technology and historical perspective. Each stage of interpretation added clarity, but also reflected the tools and assumptions available at the time. Early interpretations framed the mechanism in terms familiar to those studying clocks and simple mechanical devices. Later interpretations, informed by more advanced imaging and a deeper understanding of ancient astronomy, expanded its scope. The process is ongoing. Even now, new analyses refine existing models, challenge assumptions, and propose alternative reconstructions. This ongoing nature is not a sign that the mechanism is unclear. It is a sign that it is complex enough to sustain continued investigation. Complexity, in this context, is not defined by the number of parts alone. It is defined by the number of relationships those parts encode. Each gear does not operate independently. It interacts with others, creating a network of motion that reflects underlying cycles. Understanding the mechanism requires tracing those relationships, mapping how movement in one part translates into movement in another. This mapping mirrors the structure of the knowledge it represents. Astronomical cycles are not isolated. They intersect, overlap, and influence each other. The mechanism captures that interdependence, translating it into a physical system where each component contributes to a larger pattern. That translation is what gives the device its distinctive character. It is not merely a collection of gears. It is a model of interconnected processes. And models, by their nature, are selective. They include certain elements while excluding others. They emphasize relationships considered significant within a particular framework. Understanding the mechanism, therefore, also involves understanding what it does not include. What aspects of the sky were not modeled? What simplifications were made? What assumptions underlie the chosen cycles? These questions do not diminish the device. They place it within a context of decision-making, a context where knowledge is shaped into usable form. And that shaping is where human intention becomes most visible. Because the mechanism is not only about the sky, it is about how the sky was chosen to be represented. At this point, the object returns to where it began, not in the sea, but in the question. A ship carrying wealth sinks. Among its cargo is a machine. The machine survives, fragmented. It is found, recognized, studied. It reveals knowledge. It reveals capability. It reveals a boundary in our understanding. And that boundary does not close. Because every answer it provides leads to another question that extends beyond the object itself. How many such devices were made? Who commissioned them? How were they used in practice? Were they common within certain circles, or rare even in their own time? Did their makers understand them fully? Or were they working within traditions that guided them without requiring complete theoretical explanation? What was lost when the conditions that supported their creation changed? These are not questions that can be resolved by a single artifact, but they are questions that the artifact makes unavoidable. And that is what gives the Antikythera mechanism its enduring force. It does not simply exist as a remarkable object. It reshapes the field in which it is placed. It requires that assumptions be adjusted, that timelines be reconsidered, that the relationship between evidence and expectation be examined. It does not demand that history be rewritten, but it insists that history be held with less certainty, because certainty depends on completeness, and completeness is something the past rarely provides. What we have are fragments that, when aligned correctly, reveal structure, but never the full extent of what once existed. The Antikythera mechanism is one such fragment, exceptionally detailed, exceptionally informative, and still incomplete, which leaves us with a final position, not one of resolution, but one of awareness. An awareness that the past is not only defined by what we have found, but by what we have not. And that between those two, between the known and the missing, there is space where understanding continues to develop. Because somewhere, in a workshop we cannot locate, using tools we have not recovered, guided by knowledge we only partially reconstruct, someone built a machine that turned the sky into motion. And that machine was not meant to be mysterious. It was meant to be used. Which means there was a moment, long before the ship sank, when someone stood over it, turned the handle, and watched the heavens move in their hands. Not as myth, not as guess, but as system. And that moment still exists. Not fully, but enough. Enough to remind us that history is not only what survives intact, but what survives just clearly enough to show us that we are missing something. And maybe that is the most precise way to understand the Antikythera mechanism. Not as a machine that should not exist, but as a machine that reveals how much of existence we have not yet recovered. Hi, Chini here. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like, so you get notified when a new video drops. It's also the best way to support our channel.